can go on for hours about this story, but I'm going to try to keep it really tight so we have room for questions and people don't have to listen to me too long. You'll see the meaning of this particular title, Chinatown Through a Wide Lens, the Hidden Photographs of Yucho Chow. And I tell you a little bit about the story of finding this fellow. And just a moment here. Oops. So I always like to start off with a quote, and I think this is a really powerful quote. Photograph is a memento, evidence that this moment existed in the world at some point in time. Because when we forget, it's often these photographs that can remind us that something happened. And my journey with this fellow, who I'm not related to, I'm half Chinese, but I'm not related to him at all, began about over 10 years ago now, when I did a volunteer project to interview the remaining World War II veterans, but specifically I honed in on Chinese Canadians. They had a remarkable story. They not only served in the war at a time that they weren't citizens and they couldn't vote, but because they served, they also ended up getting the vote and full citizenship for all Chinese Canadians. So theirs was a remarkable story, but because they were aging, I would always ask them to bring out their photo albums. And I found it was a really good aid for them in terms of remembering stories. And I started to see, first of all, this really interesting Art Deco background caught my attention. And then it was always this seal that went with it. Then I went to the next family to interview them, and I would find something from the 1920s. And then another family, it was from the 1930s, and it also had a Yucho Chow seal on it. And again, a lot of the fellows who were soldiers had these photos taken in the 1940s when they're soldiers. I saw some afterwards when they came back and they got married. They were also by Yucho Chow, and I became curious about this fellow. Here's one of his seals. It's just rendered as a vector file, but it was beautiful. It was silver. It was embossed. And after about 6 or 7 of these family interviews, I decided I would go and Google him. And basically, there was almost nothing on him. And I thought, how can this be? How can someone have done so much work over such a long period of time and there's nothing there? So that began this journey to try to find this story of this man. And it took me 8 years really to do it, because it wasn't something full-time. It was just something I was doing on the side. And I learned, slowly, like peeling an onion, it revealed itself to me, his story. And interestingly, in finding the story of him, I wound up discovering the story of so many other people and communities. And it was quite surprising. So what I learned about him, Yucho Chow, was that he was the first Chinese commercial photographer in Vancouver. He started at roughly 1906, 1907 on Hastings Street, and he ran that studio to 1907 to 1949. And just to put it in perspective, in that time, we had the Asian race riots, we had the Spanish flu, we had the First World War, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is my next project. We had the Great Depression, and we had the Second World War, and then we had the fight for citizenship rights. So really tumultuous and transformative period in Vancouver's history. And it also coincided with massive waves of immigration coming in from all 4 corners of the earth. He dies in late 1949 in November, and then his 2 sons take over the studio from roughly 1950 to 1986. So that's roughly 80 years almost that this is operating. And when they finish, when they decided to retire, they, what are we going to do with all this stuff? 80 years of negatives. And they took those 80 years of negatives, which translated into almost like 5 truckloads of material, and took it to the dump. And that's why there was so little of his material anywhere in public archives and so little information on him. So that set me on this journey to learn more about him. And every time I spoke to families, I'd say, do you have a Yucho Chow photo? They'd always say no. I would look at their photo album. I would invariably find one. And slowly his story started to reveal itself. And here's a photo of him in front of his studio. This is on Main Street in the 500 block, and one of his most famous locations. So for the first 5 or 6 years, I knew him as exclusively a Chinese photographer taking photos of Chinese people. And so this is all I ever saw of his work, one after another, of beautiful portraits taken at different periods of time, really well lit, even going into hand colorization. But that's all I knew of his work. And one day, through just won't even get to the details, a whole series of circumstances, I discovered that in fact, he was, at a time when there was enormous racism, he was the photographer for almost everybody that was marginalized. And so I discovered, first of all, that he was the favorite photographer for the early Black Canadian community, very small community in Vancouver, but nevertheless, it was the place they came to have their photographs taken. This fellow, Louis Lawrence, was a very well-known boxer, lightweight boxer. This is in the late 40s. And then I learned that he was also the favorite photographer for the early South Asian community, which was primarily the Sikh community. And basically the story I heard was that no white photographer would take their photo. And there was always some excuse of, why they couldn't take the photo. So they wound up going to Yucho Chow. And he became their photographer over several decades and got exclusive rights to some of the major events that happened in that community. But he also took photos of early immigrants. There were Swedish families. The Tursa children are from a Czech background, so Eastern European. These kids, their parents had a tumultuous relationship, and you have all these photos of 1 kid, 2 kids, 3 kids, 4 kids, 5 kids. Every time the parents split up and got back together again, they had another kid, and there was another photo at Yucho Chow. Very big Croatian community that he photographed. A lot of the early Croatian community lived in the Strathcona area. Many, many photos of their community. Lily and Esther Weinstein were Romanian Jews that came over, and so he has photos of them over the years. Polish families, German. This fellow, he was a mechanic, never liked having his photograph taken, went to Yucho Chow, and apparently this was his favorite photograph. He was so proud of it. And when his daughter gave it to me, she said, this is the only photograph he ever kept in his life. And it was Yucho Chow's photo. Italian, one of the rare outside the house family photos. Another Italian, Rosina Augustino, still alive. And he also did interesting, and this is another thing about him, was just he must have been a man who the people didn't feel like he judged him, because he also did a lot of mixed race families. This is taken around 1910. Very, very rare to have a mixed race family, but he's there for them. This is the Hong and the Grant family. So the father is Hong, he's Chinese. The mother is a Grant, she's Musqueam First Nation. These are the Grant children. So the little boy there in the middle is Larry Grant, who a very well-known Musqueam elder who also does some work at UBC. Another unidentified family, but again, another mixed race family. And they all felt comfortable coming to this fellow's studio. And he did other things too, like, opera, entertainers, vaudeville acts. This is Jack Strong and Patti LaBelle. They were big on the vaudeville circuit. Howard Fair, perhaps one of my favorite children's shots. Yeah, he did these little theaters and performances of tap dance in the 1930s. Other South Asian musicians did a lot of these group shots for the Federation Russian Canadians. They're all group shots. This is one of their bands. And the same with the Ukrainians. So a lot of the photos that they submitted to me were all these large group shots of choirs and mandolin orchestras. He also took photos of those that were wealthy, the merchant class in Chinatown, which are the ones that actually could bring their wives over initially, and also those who are obviously impoverished. And he did the very famous, like Dr. Sun Yat-sen in 1911 when he came to Vancouver. The Opal family, this is soon to be famous. So that's Wally Opal, our former Attorney General, off onto the far left. And then just shots of whenever someone got a vehicle back in the 1920s, in the 1930s, that was pretty exciting. So lots of photos of vehicles. This comes from Mark Forsyth, actually. He pointed this photo out to me, and it's in Karamias in the Ranch House restaurant, I think it was. I have my notes somewhere, but somehow Yucho Chow was out there. Yucho Chow was also, because he was so welcoming of the Sikh community, early Sikh community, he was the only one that was allowed to go in and actually take photos inside their temples. So these are rare photos to find. And interestingly, and I didn't realize this too, that around 1923, when the Exclusion Act came in and every Chinese person had to register, he did a lot of those photos, but he also did a lot of what are these, for lack of a better name, are called head tax photos. So this is all taken on the same day. This fellow was a tailor. And this is another Yucho Chow photo. Quan Ju Louis was a son of the H.Y. Louis family, which runs London Drugs today and IGA, and he was killed in Europe during the war. But this was an immigration card he was given, even though he was born in Canada. So what I also found interesting was not only the wide lens that he had of the communities he took, but also how his photos had a remarkable way to reveal the commonality between people. So all these different immigrants coming from all four corners of the earth with different skin colors, different dress, different language, different religions. And yet somehow he manages to capture what they have in common, which is really, to me, beautiful. And one of the themes is separation. So a lot of the photos of our men, and that's partly because men had a certain role in society, but also because disproportionately men were here separated from their family. This is particularly true for Chinese. So I remember thinking, like, just picture man after, male after male. But it actually says something about the society at that time, that men were often here on their own. And this is a photo taken in the 1930s. So a lot of men would get their photos taken and they would send it back to China because their wives and family were back there. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, all of a sudden you see a lot of picture of two men together. And I now believe a lot of it had to do with the fact that they saved money by pooling their money together and getting a photo taken to send back to China. And one of the things to notice here is Yucho Chow would have a little box of props, pens, jewelry, pocket watches, things like that. And often men were so poor, they might have only like one or two outfits, that they would borrow a suit. And it's clear that this fellow's suit is ill-fitting. It's one of the reasons he's sitting down, because they're so poor. You look at their shoes, they're worn. But it was important to them to send a photo back to China to say, we're doing okay, you know, we're being successful. Your investment in me was worth it. But this same issue and this same idea of separation and men being here and longing for their families back home repeats itself over and over again in every community. These are two Croatian men. They're here on their own and they're waiting to save up enough to bring their wives over. This fellow, John Majaka, he was actually here for 8 years, saved up. He had this photo taken at Yucho Chow. And to me, this expresses longing, like he misses his wife and his child. So he gets Yucho Chow to superimpose them into this photo that he can keep on his dresser. And so they're reunited just in a photo. This is a photo of a Chinese family, and the woman on the left and the child she's holding have been superimposed. So this is his first wife, still in China. And the little girl on the far right has also been superimposed. So it was very common for Yucho Chow to take these, you know, two photos, one taken in China, one taken here, and create this idea that the family is all together. The other commonality, of course, is celebrations were important. So photography was special at this time, and people didn't have a lot of money. So when you got your photographs done, it was for really special occasions or something important. And of course, weddings were that. And just look at the similarities. So this is a Ukrainian couple. And then you look at the Chinese couple and you see this commonality between them, right? Just the celebration of marriage, looking your best. This is taken much later, in the 40s. And this is one of my favorites too. I just love the crisp press on his pants. They're so nice. And then, of course, children are very important. I'm not going into a lot of stories here, but just to show you some of the themes of. So whenever a new baby is born, that's the occasion for a new picture. And you see this over and over again in so many of the photos. There's about over 600 that have been collected now. Wong Chu Lip family, this is the owners of Ming Wo, for those who know Vancouver's Chinatown well. This is about 1917. Oops, sorry, I'm just not going forward here. Sam Hop family photos become important. Most of these are sent overseas. And again, you see that similarity between families. This is a Chinese family, a South Asian family. And but just that commonality that comes through, that, you know, we have the same aspirations in the end, the same needs, and between people who are so different. I love that this kid is wearing like a little cap, aviator's cap. This is taken around the time when Amelia Earhart and Lindbergh are really popular, so a lot of celebrity pilots. I put in this photo because it's a young woman and she's holding a book. And there's a lot of symbolism to these books. The idea is that children are getting an education. So they're using these books to show that. And here, most of the children in the front have a book, including the little girl. So what I discovered was not only in these interviews that photos are the ways to unlock memory, especially in older people. Often older people say, I don't know, I have no stories. I don't remember. But you bring out a photo album and watch the magic begin. And it's such an effective tool to get people to start talking. And sometimes you hear the most interesting memories, and they're just quirky sometimes, but they're so great. Now, not every photo, a lot of photos have gone silent, as we call. They're just interesting photos. I found this on eBay. He's obviously an American, Navy seaman who's somehow in Vancouver, in Chinatown with his cigarette, and you just wonder what's the story. So there's probably in the whole archive maybe about I don't know, 10% that are what I would call silent photos. They're unidentified. We don't know who these people are anymore, but beautiful, and their story has been lost as a result. But there's some that are really great. And I always like to bring this guy up because this is Ishar Singh Gill. His other name was Hindu number 10. The government, that's the only name they ever gave him when they dealt with him and made him pay taxes. But he delivered wood. He had this little business. He obviously loved that dog because it's one of the rare photos where a dog appears. And that dog was named King. And when the family gave me the photo, they said, every dog our family has ever owned since our great-grandfather has been named King. And that dog would follow him as he delivered wood. And this is Alexander Clement from Poland. And why I show this is it's a little heartbreaking. The family had 22 photos taken by Yucho Chow over a period of time. And this is the very first one. He's from Poland. He's come. It takes him 8 years to save up enough to bring his wife over, but he gets this photo taken and there's a clock on that pedestal. And often there was symbolism in these photos. So, we can now look and say, well, the clock probably means I'm waiting for you. It's a long time to wait for you to save up. But what happens is very soon after his family's reunited in the photos, suddenly he disappears from the photos. And I discovered that about a year after he finally saved to bring his wife and 2 daughters over, he was killed in a work-related accident. So in conclusion, we're really, really thrilled to have the book. And the book is such a small piece of what we're collected. We went from having very few Yucho Chows in public archives, or very few that were identified, to now having over 600, I'd say about 640 from all different communities, and most of them with a story attached. And to me, I feel that that's the real jewel in the crown of this particular project. And that each one of those, almost each one, has a story attached to it. And it's so easy for memory to disappear. It's so easy between generations for stories to disappear, and then they go extinct, and then we never ever know the answer to something. So we're really pleased that whatever we were able to capture, we tried to capture in the archive. There'll be an announcement in the early fall about where the archive is going. So we're finishing negotiations to find it a permanent home and a more public home. And so we're really grateful about the book, and thank you so much for recognizing this book. It's really a community. It belongs to the community. And so on behalf of all those communities and all those people and all those families that I've been dealing with over the last 10 years, I want to thank them on your behalf, because you honor them too. Thank you.